The wind in the Arizona Territory doesn't just blow, it screams. Calla Miller knew that sound well. It was the only music playing as she shoveled the red dirt over a tiny pine box, the final resting place of her newborn daughter. She was utterly alone. Her husband was days away, chasing gold and whiskey, leaving her to face the harsh desert winter with nothing but grief. But as the sun dipped below the canyon, a shadow stretched across the fresh grave. Calla looked up, expecting a coyote or a drifting outlaw. Instead, she stared into the war-painted face of an Apache warrior. He didn't hold a tomahawk. He held a bundle, and what he handed her would not only save her sanity, but would unravel a conspiracy of blood, stolen land, and a murder that the town of Redemption had tried to bury. November 1874. The Arizona Territory was a place where hope often went to die, parched by the sun and scoured by the wind. For Calla Miller, the world had shrunk down to a patch of disturbed earth beneath a twisted mesquite tree. Her hands were raw, blistered from the handle of the spade. She wasn't crying anymore. She had wept until her throat was dry, and her eyes were swollen shut. But now, there was only a hollow, ringing silence. Her daughter, barely 3 days old, had succumbed to the fever that swept through the valley. They hadn't even named her yet. Calla had just called her little bird. Calla stood up, wiping the grit from her faded calico dress. She looked toward the horizon. The ranch house sat 100 yards away, dark and empty. Caleb, her husband, had been gone for 2 weeks. He had ridden out to Tucson for business, he claimed. Though Calla knew business usually involved poker tables and the company of women who smelled of cheap lavender water. She was 24, but the frontier had aged her. Her blonde hair was streaked with dust, her face thin. She felt a sudden, sharp fear, not of death. She felt close enough to that already, but of the solitude. Then the horses snorted in the corral. Calla froze. She reached for the Colt Navy revolver she kept in her apron pocket, her fingers trembling against the cold steel. The sun was bleeding into the horizon, casting long purple shadows. Out of the twilight, a figure emerged. He didn't ride in. He seemed to materialize from the landscape itself. He stood tall, his chest broad and bare despite the chill, marked with the pigments of his people. He wore buckskin leggings and moccasins that made no sound on the hard-packed earth. An Apache. Calla's breath hitched. The tension in the territory was razor-thin. Raids had been frequent in the South, retaliation for the Army's encroachment. She thumbed back the hammer of the Colt. "Stay back," she croaked, her voice cracking from disuse. The warrior didn't flinch. He looked at the gun, then at the fresh grave at her feet, and finally, into her eyes. His expression was unreadable, carved from granite. He was older, perhaps in his 40s, with a scar running through his left eyebrow. He took a step forward. "I said stay back." Calla leveled the gun. Slowly, deliberately, the warrior raised his hands, but they weren't empty. In the crook of his left arm, wrapped in a rough wool trade blanket, was a bundle. He spoke then. His voice was deep, like stones grinding together. He spoke in broken English, heavily accented but clear. "No shoot, mother." He pointed to the grave, then to the bundle in his arms. "The little one, she sleeps in the earth. You weep." Calla lowered the gun an inch, confusion warring with fear. "Who are you?" "Chayton," he said. It meant falcon in the Siouan dialects, though he was Apache. He took another step, disregarding the weapon entirely. He knelt by the grave, not in disrespect, but in a strange homage. Then, he stood and extended the bundle toward her. A sound came from the wool. A soft, gurgling coo. Kalla's heart stopped. She dropped the gun. It hit the dirt with a dull thud. "Take," Chaitin said. "A life for a life. The spirits demand balance." Trembling, Kalla reached out. The warrior placed the bundle in her arms. It was heavy, warm, and smelled of wood smoke and sage. She pulled back the fold of the blanket. Staring back at her were two wide blue eyes. It was a baby boy, perhaps 6 months old. He was pale-skinned, with tufts of reddish-gold hair. He was clearly not Apache. He was a white child. Where did you get him?" Kalla gasped, clutching the child to her chest. The baby reached up, grabbing a lock of her hair. Chaitin's face darkened. "Found, in the burnt wagon, south, near the Black Canyon. His parents?" Chaitin looked toward the darkening south. "The spirits have them now. Only he remains. He needs milk. You have milk." It was true. Her body was still prepared to feed the child she had just buried. The physical ache in her chest was matched only by the emotional void. "Why bring him to me?" "You grieve," Chaitin said simply. "He lives. This is the way." Before Kalla could ask another question, who the parents were, why an Apache warrior would save a white child rather than leave him or trade him, Chaitin whistled low. A paint horse trotted out from the mesquite brush. He mounted in one fluid motion. "Wait!" Kalla cried out. The baby settled in her arms. "Will you come back?" Chaitin looked at the horizon. "The wolves are hunting, white woman. Watch the husband. He brings the storm." With that cryptic warning, he turned his horse and vanished into the darkness, leaving Kalla standing by her daughter's fresh grave, holding a stranger's son. For 3 days, Kalla stayed inside the ranch house, the shutters drawn against the wind. The baby, whom she decided to call Gabriel, for he was an unexpected messenger, was a voracious eater. Nursing him brought a strange, bittersweet relief. It eased the physical pain of her milk, and holding his warm, solid weight kept the ghosts at bay. She examined the blanket he had come in. It was high quality, woven with a distinct pattern of blue and yellow thread, not the typical rough-spun wool of the local settlers. Pinned to the inside of the fabric was a small silver locket. Kalla pried it open with a fingernail. Inside was a tin-type photograph of a woman, elegant and smiling, standing next to a man with a stern jawline and a handlebar mustache. They looked wealthy. Easterners, perhaps moving west for land or mining. She hid the locket beneath the floorboards in the pantry. If Chaitin had found the baby in a burnt wagon, it meant a raid. If the army found out she was harboring a survivor brought by an Apache, they would take the boy and likely question her until she broke. On the 4th evening, the dogs began to bark. Kalla looked out the window. A cloud of dust signaled the arrival of a buckboard wagon. It was Caleb. She felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Caleb Miller was a big man, broad-shouldered with a temper that flared like gunpowder. He had married Kalla for her father's dowry, and when that money ran dry, his affection had evaporated with it. She placed Gabriel in the wicker cradle she had woven for her own daughter. She took a deep breath and walked out to the porch. Caleb climbed down, dusting off his heavy duster coat. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot from days of drinking. He didn't offer a hug or a kiss. "Where's the girl?" he asked, not looking at her, busy unhitching the horses. "She died, Caleb," Kalla said, her voice flat. 3 days ago." Caleb paused. He spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Fever?" "Yes." He nodded, showing no more emotion than if she'd told him a calf had died. "Well, Hard country. Weak things don't last. The cruelty of it slapped her, but she didn't flinch. She was used to his hardness. I buried her by the mesquite tree. I'll check the fence line tomorrow, he grunted, grabbing his saddlebags. He walked past her, smelling of stale whiskey and sweat. He entered the house. Calla followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched as he threw his bags on the table and poured himself a glass of water. Then a sound came from the corner. A soft, distinctive coo. Caleb froze. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the cradle. I thought you said she died. She did, Calla said quickly, stepping between him and the cradle. Then what in the hell is that? Caleb pushed past her. He looked into the cradle. He stared at the blue-eyed boy, the reddish-gold hair. Caleb's face went pale, not with confusion, but with something else, recognition. He spun around, grabbing Calla by the wrist. Where did you get this brat? I found him. Calla lied, the story stumbling out. A wagon, travelers. They were sick, dying. They left him at the gate. Liar, Caleb roared. He shook her. There ain't been no wagons on the North Road for weeks. I rode that way. He was abandoned, Caleb. What was I supposed to do? Leave him to the coyotes? Caleb looked back at the baby. His breathing was heavy, erratic. He looked terrified. Red hair, he muttered to himself. Blue eyes. He released Calla, shoving her back against the wall. Get rid of it. What? You hear me, woman. Get rid of it. Ride him into town, drop him at the orphanage in Prescott. I don't care. But he don't stay under my roof. He's a baby. I have milk, Caleb. He needs me. He ain't ours, Caleb shouted, his hand drifting to the knife at his belt, a nervous tic he had when he was cornered. You don't know who he belongs to. You don't know what kind of trouble comes with a stray. He's staying, Calla said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. My daughter is dead. I am keeping this boy. Caleb stared at her, his eyes cold and calculating. He seemed to be weighing options. Finally, he sneered. Fine. You want to play mother? Go ahead. But when the Reaper comes looking for that boy, don't expect me to stand in the way. He stormed into the bedroom and slammed the door. Calla rushed to the cradle, scooping Gabriel up. She went to the window, looking out into the darkness. Watch the husband, Chayton had said. He brings the storm. Why had Caleb looked so frightened? Why did the sight of a red-headed baby make a man who feared nothing but poverty shake in his boots? 2 weeks passed. The tension in the Miller household was thick enough to choke on. Caleb was rarely home. He spent his days riding the perimeter of their land and his nights meeting with men who rode in late. Rough men, gun hands like Silas Vane, a notorious mercenary from Texas. Calla kept her head down, caring for Gabriel. She noticed Caleb watching the boy when he thought she wasn't looking. He watched him with a mixture of hatred and paranoia. One afternoon, while Caleb was out with Silas, Calla decided to clean Caleb's study. It was a forbidden room, usually locked, but Caleb had been careless in his haste to leave that morning. She entered the dusty room, filled with maps and ledgers. She wasn't snooping for the sake of it. She was hunting for the truth. On his desk lay a map of the valley. Their ranch, the Broken M, was outlined in black ink. But the neighboring land, a massive, fertile tract known as the Black Canyon Range, was circled in red. That land had been owned by the O'Malley family, a wealthy Irish family who had moved in from the east 6 months ago. Calla's breath caught. O'Malley, red hair. She rushed to the pantry and retrieved the silver locket she had hidden. She opened it. The man in the picture, the one with the handlebar mustache, had the same jawline as Gabriel. She went back to the study and began frantically searching the drawers. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unpaid bills, she found a leather-bound ledger. It wasn't Caleb's handwriting. It was elegant, cursive script. October 14th, 1874. The survey is complete. The gold deposits in the lower creek are substantial. If we can get the irrigation rights, this land is worth millions. I fear the locals are hostile, particularly our neighbor, Mr. Miller. He has made threats regarding the water access. It was O'Malley's diary. Calla's hand shook as she flipped to the final entry, dated 3 weeks ago. November the 2nd. We are packing to leave for a week to file the claim in Tucson, taking the wife and the baby. We don't feel safe here anymore. I saw riders on the ridge today. I believe they are Miller's men. November the 2nd. That was 2 days before Chayton brought Gabriel to her. The realization hit Calla like a physical blow. Caleb hadn't gone to Tucson for business. He had organized a raid. He had murdered the O'Malleys to stop them from filing the gold claim, made it look like an Apache attack, and stolen the land. But they had missed the baby. Or perhaps the baby had been thrown from the wagon during the attack and found by Chayton. Looking for something, darling? Calla spun around. Caleb was standing in the doorway. Silas Vane was behind him, a toothpick rolling in his mouth and a Winchester rifle resting on his shoulder. Caleb's eyes dropped to the ledger in Calla's hands. A cruel, twisted smile spread across his face. I told you, Caleb said softly, stepping into the room. Curiosity kills more than just cats in this country. You killed them, Calla whispered, clutching the ledger. You killed the O'Malleys. I did what I had to do to secure our future, Caleb snarled, his facade dropping. That land has gold, Calla. Enough gold to make us kings. But that Irishman wouldn't sell. He wanted a war. So you murdered his family. It was a business transaction, Silas chuckled from the doorway. Though we did lose track of the little runt. I assume that's the brat squalling in the other room. Caleb pulled his Bowie knife from its sheath. The blade glinted in the afternoon sun. I knew that Apache had something to do with it, Caleb said. I should have killed that savage years ago. And now, my own wife turns against me. Caleb, please. Calla backed up against the desk. I won't tell anyone. Just let us go. Oh, you're going, Caleb said, advancing. You and that bastard child are going to take a little trip. A wagon accident, maybe. Tragic. Grieving mother, driven mad, drives off a cliff. Grab her, Silas, Caleb commanded. Silas moved forward, grabbing Calla by the arm. She screamed, kicking out, but he was too strong. He dragged her toward the door. Don't hurt the boy, she shrieked. The boy dies first, Caleb said, walking toward the cradle in the living room. Thwack! An arrow suddenly sprouted from the doorframe, inches from Silas's face. The feathers were red and black. Silas froze, dropping Calla. Through the open front door, a figure sat on horseback in the yard. Chayton. He had a bow drawn, the string pulled back to his ear. Behind him were 3 other Apache warriors, painted for war. I told you, Chayton's voice boomed, carrying over the wind. The husband brings the storm. Today, the storm breaks. The arrow in the doorframe vibrated with a low hum, a sound that seemed to freeze time in the Miller ranch house. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Silas Vane stared cross-eyed at the shaft of wood, inches from his nose, his bravado instantly replaced by the primal instinct of a hunted animal. "Apaches!" Silas roared, diving behind the heavy oak dining table just as a second arrow shattered the window glass, burying itself in the plaster where his head had been. Caleb reacted with the desperation of a cornered rat. He didn't look at the attackers. He looked at Calla. He lunged for her, his knife slashing through the air. "You brought them here! You witch!" Calla threw herself backward, crashing into the desk. The ledger, the damning evidence of Caleb's murders, slid across the floor. Caleb scrambled for it, but Calla kicked out, her boot connecting with his jaw. He reeled back, spitting blood, his eyes wild with a mixture of greed and fury. "Silas, kill the Indians! I'll handle the bitch!" Caleb screamed. Silas popped up with his Winchester, levering a round into the chamber. Crack! The rifle shot thundered in the small room. Outside, Chayton's paint horse reared, but the warrior was already moving, sliding off the saddle and vanishing behind the water trough. Calla saw her chance. While Caleb was disoriented, she didn't run for the door. She ran for the cradle. The living room was a crossfire hurricane. Bullets chewed up the wood siding. Arrows hissed through the open door. She reached the cradle just as Gabriel let out a terrified wail. She scooped him up, pressing his face into her shoulder to muffle his cries. "Going somewhere?" Caleb had recovered. He stood between her and the back door, the bloody knife in his hand. His face was a mask of pure malice. "Give me the boy, Calla. I'll make it quick." "You're not a husband," Calla spat, her fear crystallizing into a cold, hard rage. "You're a monster." "I'm a survivor," Caleb lunged. Crash! The front door was kicked off its hinges. It wasn't Chayton. It was one of the younger braves, a whirlwind of motion. He didn't carry a gun. He held a war club. He slammed into Silas Vane, who was reloading. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs and curses. Distracted, Caleb turned his head for a fraction of a second. Calla didn't hesitate. She grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the wood stove next to her. With every ounce of strength she possessed, fueled by the grief of her lost daughter and the need to protect this stolen son, she swung it. The iron connected with the side of Caleb's head with a sickening crunch. Caleb's eyes rolled back. He crumpled to the floor, unconscious but breathing. Calla didn't wait to see if he would wake up. She grabbed the leather-bound ledger from the floor where it had fallen, shoved it into her apron, and sprinted out the back door into the twilight. The cool air hit her face. The yard was a chaotic scene of dust and smoke. She heard Chayton's voice, sharp and commanding. "Here, woman!" Chayton was circling the house on his horse. He extended a hand. Calla shifted the baby to one arm and reached up. With surprising strength, Chayton hauled her up behind him. "Hold tight," he grunted. "My husband. He's inside. He's alive," Calla yelled over the gunfire. "He is of no matter now. The soldiers come soon. We must ride." Chayton kicked his horse into a gallop. As they crested the ridge, Calla looked back. The Broken M Ranch, the place where she had buried her child and lost her innocence, was shrinking in the distance. Smoke was pouring from the windows. She wasn't just leaving a house. She was leaving the white world. She was riding into the wilderness with a savage and a kidnapped baby, branded a traitor by her own people. But as she felt the steady beat of the horse's heart beneath her leg, Calla realized she had never felt safer. The journey into the Superstition Mountains was a descent into a world that civilization had not yet touched. For 2 grueling days, They rode through a landscape that seemed designed to break the human spirit. The terrain was a jagged jawbone of red rock, cactus spines, and vertical drops that fell away into bottomless shadows. Calla held on to Chayton's waist, her body numb from the saddle, her arms aching from the weight of the baby. Gabriel had been quiet for the first day, but by the second afternoon, his silence had turned into a whimpering lethargy. His skin was hot to the touch, a dry, burning heat that terrified Calla more than the bullets they had fled. They were not alone. Chayton's small band, 3 other warriors named Kotsa, Dasan, and Halian, moved like wraiths around them. They rode without saddles, their ponies picking through the shale with impossible grace. They didn't speak. They communicated in hand signs and the mimicry of bird calls, a language born of the land itself. By the time the sun began to bleed into the western horizon on the 3rd day, they reached the sanctuary. It was a box canyon known to the Apache as Canyon of the Whispering Wind. The walls shot up 300 feet, sheer sandstone that glowed ember red in the twilight. The entrance was narrow, a bottleneck that opened into a natural amphitheater protected from the biting desert gales. "We stop," Chayton announced, sliding off his paint horse. His voice was rough, coated in dust. "The horses need water. The boy needs rest." Calla slid down, her legs nearly giving way. She stumbled toward a small depression in the rock where a spring trickled from a crack, feeding a small pool bordered by hardy ferns. She sat heavily, unwrapping Gabriel from the dusty shawl. "He's burning up, Chayton," Calla whispered, dipping a rag into the cool water and dabbing the baby's forehead. "He needs medicine. He needs a roof." Chayton began to unsaddle the horse, his movements efficient and precise. "The roof does not make the fever break, woman. The spirit fights the body. He is strong. He has the blood of the red beard." Calla looked up, her eyes stinging with fatigue. "You keep calling his father that. Red beard. You talk as if you owed him something." Chayton paused. He walked over to the small fire Kotsa was building, a smokeless fire made of dry greasewood roots hidden deep in a rock overhang. He sat across from Calla, the flickering light casting deep shadows across his scarred face. He pulled a strip of dried venison from his pouch and handed it to her. "Eat. Then you will have milk." Calla took the meat but didn't eat. "Tell me, if we are going to die out here, I want to know why an Apache warrior risked his life for a white baby and a settler's wife." Chayton stared into the fire. The wind whistled through the canyon crevices, creating the eerie, hushed voices that gave the place its name. "2 moons ago," Chayton began, his voice low and rhythmic, "I was hunting near the Salt River. I was alone. I tracked a cougar. I did not see the iron teeth beneath the leaves." "A bear trap," Calla guessed. "A wolf trap," Chayton corrected, "put there by your people. The jaws snapped on my leg. Bone did not break, but the iron bit deep. I could not open it. I was trapped for 2 days. The sun cooked my mind. The coyotes circled, waiting for me to sleep." He gestured to the scar on his eyebrow. "Then the man came, the one with the hair of fire, O'Malley. He found you? He found me. He had a rifle. He could have shot me. A dead Apache is worth $50 in Tucson. It is the bounty." Chayton's dark eyes bored into Calla's, but he did not shoot. He saw the trap. He put down his gun. He used a heavy branch to pry the jaws open. He gave me water from his canteen. He washed the wound with whiskey. Calla felt a tear slide down her dusty cheek. She could picture it. The O'Malley man, civilized and wealthy, showing mercy to a sworn enemy in the middle of nowhere. It was the exact opposite of Caleb. He spoke words I did not know, Chayton continued. But I understood. He let me go. He turned his back to me and walked away. He gave me my life. When I saw the smoke at his wagon, when I saw the bodies, I knew I could not pay the debt to him, so I pay it to the cub. He looked at Gabriel, who was finally sleeping, his breathing shallow. And you? Chayton pointed a calloused finger at Calla. You are not like the other white women. They scream. They faint. You dug the grave. You swung the iron skillet. You ride with the wind. I had no choice, Calla said softly. There is always a choice, Chayton said. To lay down and die, or to stand and bleed. You chose to stand. That is why you are Nantan Lupan. What does it mean? Gray Wolf Mother. Calla looked down at her hands, stained with earth and dried blood. She didn't feel like a wolf. She felt like a ghost. Suddenly, the silence of the canyon was shattered. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a sound far more subtle, the click of a horseshoe striking stone. Chayton was on his feet in a heartbeat, his relaxed posture vanishing instantly. He was a statue of tension, head cocked, listening to the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. Kotsa and the other warriors were already moving, melting into the darkness of the canyon edges, weapons drawn. What is it? Calla whispered, clutching Gabriel to her chest. Metal shoes, Chayton hissed. Many horses. They move slow. They track. Is it the army? Chayton shook his head. Army rides heavy. They make noise with sabers and canteens. These men ride quiet. Hunters. Calla's blood ran cold. Caleb and Silas Vane. They have found the trail, Chayton said, scanning the high rim of the canyon. The wind carried our scent. We have to leave. Calla stood up, panic rising in her chest. Chayton, we have to ride out the back way. Chayton looked at the horses. They were standing with their heads low, their flanks heaving. They were exhausted. Then he looked at Gabriel, trembling with fever in Calla's arms. The horses are spent, Chayton said grimly. The pass ahead is steep rock. If we ride tonight, the horses will break a leg in the dark. If we run, the cold will kill the boy before the morning sun. So we just stay here and die? Calla's voice cracked. No. Chayton turned to her, his face painted with a terrifying resolve. We do not run. We set the snare. The box canyon is a trap, Gray Wolf Mother. But tonight, we decide who is the hunter and who is the prey. He grabbed Calla by the arm, guiding her away from the fire and toward the cliff wall. He pointed to a fissure in the rock face, a narrow climb that led to a small, hidden cave about 30 feet up. Go, he commanded. Take the child. Climb high. Do not make a sound. Do not come out, no matter what you hear, even if I fall. Calla hesitated, looking at the formidable climb. Chayton, there are too many of them. Chayton pulled a long knife from his belt, a heavy Bowie knife he had taken from a soldier years ago. He pressed the handle into Calla's hand. The steel was cold and heavy. If the snake husband comes to the cave, Chayton said, his voice hard as flint, you know what to do. I won't let him take the boy, Calla vowed, her grip tightening on the handle. Go. Calla scrambled up the scree, her boots slipping on the loose rock. She hauled herself up the narrow chimney, scraping her elbows raw, protecting Gabriel with her body. When she finally reached the small cave, she collapsed, breathless. It was a shallow depression, hidden by a screen of dry brush. From her vantage point, she could see the entire canyon floor bathed in the silver light of the moon. She saw Chayton down below, kicking dirt over the fire to extinguish it, plunging the canyon into shadow. She saw the warriors positioning themselves behind boulders and scrub oak, blending so perfectly with the land that they seemed to vanish into thin air. Then, the entrance of the canyon darkened. Silhouettes appeared, men on horseback, moving slowly, cautiously. Calla counted them as they filed in. 10, 12, 14 men. The moonlight caught the glint of a silver star on a vest. A marshal. But riding next to him, with a bandage wrapped around his head and a face twisted in hate, was Caleb Miller. "I smell smoke." Caleb's voice drifted up, echoing ominously off the walls. "They're here, Marshal. I can feel it. The savage is here, and he's got my wife." Calla pressed her hand over Gabriel's mouth as he stirred, tears streaming silently down her face. She gripped the knife Chayton had given her. The trap was set. The canyon held its breath, waiting for the first drop of blood to fall. The silence in the canyon stretched tight as a bowstring. Below, the posse fanned out, their horses nervous, hooves clattering on the loose stone. Calla pressed herself into the dirt of the high cave, her hand clamped over Gabriel's mouth, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Something ain't right, Caleb." A voice drifted up, Marshal Higgins. "It's too quiet. Even the crickets have stopped." "They're hiding in the rocks." Caleb's voice was a jagged rasp. "Scared of the law. You there, Vane. Light a torch. Let's see what shadows we're chasing." A match flared. As the flame touched a pitch-soaked brand, illuminating the canyon floor in a sudden wash of orange light, the trap sprung. Thwip. A sound like a tearing sheet cut through the air. The man holding the torch gasped, stumbling backward with an arrow protruding from his shoulder. He dropped the brand, and the darkness seemed to rush back in, more menacing than before. "Ambush!" Silas Vane roared, diving behind a fallen slab of sandstone. "Douse the lights! Get to cover!" The canyon erupted. It wasn't a battle of lines and orders. It was chaos. Chayton and his 3 warriors were invisible, shifting positions after every shot. A muzzle flash would bloom from the high rocks to the left, followed by the crack of a Winchester, sending the posse scrambling. Then, an arrow would hiss from the right. The echoes magnified the sound, making 4 Apache warriors sound like 40. Calla watched from above, terrified and mesmerized. The canyon floor was a strobe-lit nightmare of gunfire and shouting men. "Hold your fire, damn it! You're shooting at shadows!" Marshal Higgins bellowed, trying to maintain order as his deputies fired wildly into the cliffs. "Kill them all!" Caleb was screaming, crouching behind his horse, his eyes scanning the darkness, not for targets, but for his wife. "The woman! Find the woman!" The tide of the battle began to turn, not through skill, but through sheer brute force. Caleb had come prepared for a war. "Vane!" Caleb shouted. "Bring up the mule. Set up the gun." Calla peered over the ledge. 2 men were dragging a terrified mule forward. They unpacked a heavy canvas-covered contraption. As they stripped the cover, the moonlight glinted on brass barrels. A Gatling gun. It was an older model, clunky and heavy, likely surplus from the war, but in a confined box canyon, it was a weapon of mass slaughter. "No," Calla whispered. Silas Vane cranked the handle. The mechanism clattered, then roared. Rat-a-tat-tat-tat-tat. The sound was deafening, a mechanical thunderstorm that drowned out all other noise. A stream of lead chewed into the sandstone walls where Chayton had been firing. Rock splintered and flew like shrapnel. The Apache warriors were pinned instantly, forced deep into the crevices of the canyon walls. "That's it," Caleb laughed, a manic, high-pitched sound. "Chew 'em up. Now, flush them out. Burn the brush." "Caleb, that ain't necessary," Higgins yelled over the gun. "It's my land, Marshal. I'll burn it if I want to. Flush the rats." Under the cover of the Gatling gun's suppression fire, two of Caleb's hired hands ran forward with kerosene tins. They splashed the fuel onto the dry mesquite and tumbleweeds at the canyon's mouth and threw a lit match. The effect was instantaneous. The dry wood, seasoned by years of drought, caught with a whoosh. A wall of fire roared to life, feeding on the oxygen in the narrow canyon. Up in the cave, the temperature spiked. Smoke, thick and oily, began to roll up the cliff face, drawn by the draft. Calla coughed, shielding Gabriel. The baby began to wail, a thin, high cry that was lost in the roar of the fire. The smoke was stinging her eyes, filling her lungs. The heat was becoming unbearable. If she stayed, they would suffocate. If she climbed down, she would be shot. She looked at the knife in her hand. Then she looked at the ledger in her pocket, the heavy book that detailed every ounce of gold Caleb had stolen, and the murder he had planned. "I will not die in a hole," she rasped, her voice rough with smoke. Calla stood up. She stepped out of the cave onto the narrow limestone ledge, fully visible against the backdrop of the smoke-filled moon. "Caleb!" she screamed. Her voice, shrill and desperate, cut through the mechanical rhythm of the Gatling gun. Down below, heads turned. The firing slowed. "Stop!" Marshal Higgins ordered, waving his hat. "Cease fire! Look up there!" The Gatling gun spun to a halt. The silence that followed was filled only by the crackle of the flames eating the brush. Caleb stepped out from behind his horse. He looked up, squinting through the haze. He saw her, a silhouette in a torn dress, holding a baby in one arm and a book in the other. "Calla!" Caleb called out, his voice dripping with a sickly sweetness. "Come down, darling. It's over. You're safe now. The savages can't hurt you." "The only savage here is you," Calla yelled back. She held the ledger high. "I know what you did, Caleb. I have the book, O'Malley's diary." A murmur rippled through the posse. The deputies exchanged uneasy glances. "She's delirious," Caleb shouted to the men, his face twisting in panic. "The heat's got to her. She's talking nonsense." "It's all in here," Calla screamed, addressing the marshal directly. "October 14th. He surveyed the land. November 2nd. He ambushed the wagon. He killed the parents and tried to kill this boy." Marshal Higgins stepped toward Caleb, his hand resting on his revolver. "Is that true, Miller? You said it was an Apache raid." Caleb's eyes darted between the marshal and his wife. The walls were closing in. The charade was crumbling. His greed had built a house of cards, and Calla was holding the match. "Silas!" Caleb shrieked, pointing up at the ledge. "She's got a gun. Shoot her." "She's holding a book, Miller," Higgins shouted. "Do it, Vane, or you don't get paid." Silas Vane, cold and mercenary to the bone, didn't hesitate. He wasn't shooting to kill. He was shooting to end the standoff. He raised his Winchester and fired a single shot at the rock shelf supporting Calla's weight. Crack. The shale, already weakened by the heat and the earlier Gatling fire, shattered. Calla screamed as the ledge gave way beneath her. She fell 20 feet, tumbling down the steep scree slope. She hit the ground hard, rolling instinctively to tuck her body around Gabriel. They slid through the dust and ash, coming to a stop near the edge of the inferno. The ledger flew from her hand. It skidded across the dirt and landed dangerously close to the flames. Caleb was on her before she could breathe. He kicked Calla in the ribs, flipping her onto her back. She gasped, the wind knocked out of her, clutching the crying baby. "You stupid, stubborn witch," Caleb hissed. He snatched the ledger from the ground. He looked at it for 1 second, the evidence of his damnation, and then hurled it into the heart of the bonfire. "No!" Calla shrieked, reaching out. "Gone!" Caleb sneered, looming over her. The firelight made him look like a demon, his eyes wide and white. "And now you go too. A tragic accident. Killed in the crossfire." He drew his Colt revolver, aiming it at her chest. "Marshall!" Calla screamed, but Higgins was blocked by the fire and the confusion. Caleb pulled back the hammer. "Goodbye, Calla." Thud. A heavy, wet impact sounded, like a butcher striking meat. Caleb staggered forward, the shot going wide into the dirt. He looked down. The head of a tomahawk was buried in his right shoulder, severing the muscle. He screamed, dropping the gun. Through the wall of smoke, a figure emerged. It was Chayton. He was bleeding from 3 separate bullet wounds, his chest heaving, his war paint smeared with blood and ash. He looked less like a man and more like the spirit of vengeance itself. He had thrown his last weapon. Now, he had only his hands. "Shoot him!" Caleb squealed, clutching his shoulder, backing away toward the fire. "Help me!" But the posse stood frozen. They had seen Caleb burn the book. They had seen him aim at his wife. The spell of authority was broken. Chayton didn't run. He walked. He walked through the sparks and the heat, his eyes locked on Caleb. Caleb, panic-stricken, fumbled for the knife in his boot with his left hand. He lunged at the Apache, a desperate, clumsy strike. Chayton caught Caleb's wrist. The warrior was weakened by blood loss, but his grip was iron. He twisted the arm, forcing Caleb around. They grappled at the edge of the inferno, the heat blistering their skin. "The debt is paid," Chayton growled in English, his voice a low rumble. He shoved. Caleb stumbled back. His heel caught on a rock. He flailed, his arms windmilling, but there was nothing to grab. He fell backward, screaming, directly into the roaring bonfire he had built to kill them. The flames swallowed him. His screams were terrible, piercing the night, thrashing in the heart of the blaze until the smoke choked him into silence. Calla pulled herself up, clutching Gabriel. She watched the fire. Chayton stood by the edge of the flames for a moment, watching the storm consume the man who brought it. Then, the great warrior's knees buckled. He collapsed into the dust, the blood from his wounds pooling dark against the red earth. "Chayton!" Calla cried, scrambling toward him. Marshal Higgins and the deputies finally rushed forward, kicking sand onto the fire, guns lowered. The battle was over. The only sound left was the crackle of the dying flames and the soft, terrified whimpers of the child who had survived it all. The dawn that followed the night of fire was gray and somber, smelling of wet ash and cooling iron. The box canyon, once a place of violent echoes, was now deathly silent. Marshal Higgins knelt beside Chayton. The Apache warrior was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. His chest was a map of violence. 3 bullet wounds, burned skin, and bruises that would have killed a lesser man hours ago. "He's done for, Calla," Higgins said quietly, standing up and dusting off his knees. "Even if I wanted to help him, the town won't take kindly to a renegade in the doctor's office. Best to let him go here." Calla, her face streaked with soot and tears, looked up from where she sat rocking Gabriel. The fear that had driven her for weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding steel. "No," she said. Higgins blinked. Ma'am. Calla stood up. She handed Gabriel to the youngest deputy, a boy who looked terrified to be holding a baby. She walked over to Chayton and tore the hem of her petticoat, pressing the fabric against his bleeding chest. "Put him in the wagon," Calla ordered. "Now, Mrs. Miller," Higgins started, his tone patronizing. "You've been through a hell of a shock. But this man is a wanted—" "This man," Calla interrupted, her voice cutting through the canyon air like a whip, "saved the O'Malley heir. He saved me. And he killed the murderer you failed to catch. You will put him in the wagon, Marshal, and you will ride him to Doc Amos. If he dies because you dragged your feet, I will tell every newspaper in the territory that the law stood by and let a hero bleed out." Higgins stared at her. He looked at the charred remains of Caleb Miller, still smoking in the fire pit. He looked at the silent, respectful distance the other Apache warriors, Kotza and the others, were keeping on the ridge. "Load 'em up," Higgins grunted to his men. The trial of Silas Vane, 3 months later, was the event of the decade for the Arizona Territory. The courthouse in Prescott was packed to the rafters. Though the ledger, the damning diary of Patrick O'Malley, had been consumed by the fire, the testimony was irrefutable. Marshal Higgins took the stand and recounted the events in the canyon, the ambush, the Gatling gun, and Caleb's attempt to murder his wife. But it was Calla who silenced the room. Dressed in simple black, holding Gabriel on her lap, she told the story not as a victim, but as a witness. She spoke of the greed that had rotted her husband's soul. She spoke of the O'Malley family, murdered for a vein of gold in the creek. When Silas Vane was sentenced to hang, there were no cheers, only a heavy, somber acknowledgement that justice, though messy, had been served. Calla returned to the Broken M Ranch, but she didn't stay in the house. She couldn't. The walls held too many memories of Caleb's heavy footsteps. Instead, she moved into the O'Malley homestead on the neighboring Black Canyon Range. She petitioned the courts for guardianship of Gabriel. With no living relatives found back east, and with the testimony of her bravery, the judge granted it. She wasn't just his guardian. She was his mother in every way that mattered. But there was one piece of business left: the gold. Surveyors came from Tucson, eager to reopen the claim that Caleb had killed for. They offered Calla a fortune for the mining rights. She took them to the creek. She showed them the clear, running water that fed the valley's cattle and the wild herds. "My husband died for this metal," Calla told the lead surveyor. "He killed a family for it. This gold is cursed. There will be no mine here." "But Mrs. Miller," the man protested, "you're sitting on millions." "I'm sitting on blood," she replied. "Pack your tools. We raise cattle here. Nothing else." 6 months passed. The scars of the past began to fade, replaced by the calluses of hard work. Calla ran the Black Canyon Ranch with a firmness that surprised the local hands. She paid fair wages, she didn't tolerate drunks, and she was known throughout the county as the widow who walked through fire. It was a late afternoon in October when the dogs began to bark. Calla was on the front porch, churning butter, while Gabriel, now a sturdy toddler with a shock of red hair, wobbled around chasing a beetle. She wiped her hands on her apron and looked toward the ridge. A single rider was silhouetted against the setting sun. Her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the night in the canyon. Dr. Amos had patched him up, but Chayton had refused to stay in the town a moment longer than necessary. He had vanished into the mountains before his stitches were even out. Calla picked up Gabriel. "Look," she whispered. Look who it is. She walked out to the fence line. The rider descended slowly. Chayton looked different. The war paint was gone. He wore a clean buckskin shirt and a necklace of turquoise. His limp was slight, barely noticeable. He stopped his horse 10 feet from the fence. He didn't dismount. The barrier between their worlds, settler and native, remained, but the hostility was gone. You live, Chayton said. It wasn't a question. We live, Calla nodded, hoisting Gabriel up. Thanks to you. Chayton looked at the boy. Gabriel stared back with wide blue eyes, fearless. The cub grows, Chayton noted. He has the fire of the red beard, but the eyes of the mother wolf. He knows your name, Calla said. I tell him stories about the falcon who brought him home. Chayton's stoic face cracked, just a fraction, into something resembling a smile. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small object wrapped in leather. He tossed it gently. Calla caught it with one hand. It was a carving, a small, intricate wolf made of ironwood, polished smooth. For the boy, Chayton said, to remember that he walks between worlds. Will you come in? Calla asked, opening the gate. There is food. There is a place by the fire. Chayton looked at the open gate, then back at the mountains that loomed purple in the distance. The hawk does not nest in the barn, Nantan Lupan, he said softly. My war is done here, but the path goes on. He gathered his reins. The paint horse shifted, eager to run. Chayton, Calla called out. He paused. Thank you. Chayton looked at her one last time. He raised his hand, palm out, a gesture of peace and respect that bridged the chasm of history between their people. Watch the wind, Calla, he said. With a kick of his heels, he turned the horse. He didn't look back. Calla watched him ride, a solitary figure moving through the sagebrush, getting smaller and smaller until he was just a shadow against the dying light. She looked down at the wooden wolf in her hand, then at the son she had chosen, and who had been chosen for her. The wind blew across the vast Arizona territory. It rustled the dry grass and spun the windmill blades. It no longer sounded like a scream or a mournful cry. To Calla Miller, standing tall on her own land, it sounded like a song of freedom. Come on, Gabriel, she whispered, kissing the top of his head. Let's go home. And that, my friends, is the legend of Calla Miller and the Apache warrior Chayton, a story of how a grieving mother found a new purpose and how the unlikeliest of allies brought down a tyrant. Justice in the Old West wasn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it was found at the end of a tomahawk and the courage of a woman who refused to break. If this story moved you, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Do you think Calla made the right choice keeping the gold in the ground? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe and ring that bell. I've got another tale of betrayal and revenge from the 1880s coming up next week that you won't want to miss. Thanks for watching, and keep riding the trail.